What is your understanding of the word proficiency? Now, this is a concept that we use all the time in our language classrooms. Now, how about the word performance? This concept is also becoming more commonplace in our language teacher vernacular. But when we say that we are proficiency oriented or teach towards proficiency, are we also able to assess proficiency in our language classrooms? Or should we focus on performance? And what does that even mean? Well, that is our topic for this episode, defining exactly what we mean by proficiency and performance, and then how they relate to each other and which one we should focus on and assess in our classrooms. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to join me, to listen to what teachers are doing in their classroom, to think about what you're doing in your classroom, all the things that make you an incredible educator. So thank you so much for doing that. If you feel like you are getting lots of useful tips, tools, and resources for your classrooms in these episodes, I would really appreciate it if you could go over to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating, hopefully a 5. That would be incredible. And a little note there, a little review, a little rating, so that other teachers can see it. That helps other teachers have it pop up as a possibility for them. And we can get more people into this community sharing out and just offering more ideas. So that would be absolutely incredible. And while you're there, make sure that you are liking, subscribing, whatever the app is asking you to do, whether you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, lots of different possibilities. Always appreciate the follow there as well. So we are going to get into this idea of proficiency and performance. And as I said in the intro, these are words that we are starting to use a lot more in our classrooms. So I thought it would be a good idea to just kind of take them on for a little bit and to really dive into what they mean, to make sure we truly understand what these notions are and how they are used in our classroom, or if they should be used in our classroom. And ACTFL recently published their 2024 ACTFL Proficiency Guidelines, and there's actually a section right away close to the beginning, it's actually on page 7, with a great graphic and explanation about this idea of proficiency and performance. And it's done in a way that I really haven't seen before, so I can see that it's a topic that's really on the forefront and making sure that teachers are understanding it. So I thought, let's talk about it on the podcast. So I'd like to dive into this topic to shed light on these essential aspects of language acquisition, because an understanding of these concepts is crucial for tailoring our approaches to better support our students in the classroom. And as I've been doing more recently with all of my podcast episodes, that I'm also writing up a blog post with it. It gets a little more into detail with some examples. So if you'd like to have access to these ideas in written form for access later on, you can just head on over to wlclassroom.com/proficiency and performance. That's wlclassroom.com/proficiency and performance. And the link will also be in the show notes as well. I'll remind you of that at the end. But let's jump into proficiency and performance. So let's begin with just a definition of what they are, because sometimes they're conflated, and I just want to make sure that we start by just having a fundamental understanding of how they differ or where they're the same. So when it comes to proficiency, and this is mostly using the ACTFL definitions of them, but proficiency, now this term refers to a learner's ability to use the language across various situations. And this is regardless of how familiar they are with those topics or contexts. So it's really this unrehearsed situation. It's spontaneous language. It's not something they're prepared for. So it's that learner's ability to use language across various situations that they haven't practiced necessarily. So it's about what one can do with the language no matter where, when, or how it was learned or acquired. Now, performance, on the other hand, this is more about using the language within structured settings like classrooms. So it's about applying learned language skills within familiar contexts and content areas that they have practiced. So when it comes to an assessment of performance, this has had a lot of scaffolding. There has been a lot of focus on the exact skills that will be necessary to perform on that performance assessment. Now, again, proficiency is outside of that. It's spontaneous. It's unanticipated language. It's in real world scenarios. So that's the big difference between performance and proficiency. So performance is that classroom experience where they are prepared. There's instruction involved. And proficiency is spontaneous and unrehearsed. And actually, on page 7 of the new actual proficiency standards that were recently published, there is a really great graphic. It's table 1, and it is titled Assessing Performance versus Assessing Proficiency. And on the left-hand side, it has these 4 ideas for assessing performance. So it says that when you're assessing performance, it's based on instruction, it's rehearsed, it's familiar content and context, and it's demonstrated performance of rehearsed tasks and contexts. Now, on the right-hand side, it has the assessing proficiency. Now, this says that it is independent of specific instruction or curriculum. It's not rehearsed. It's broad content and contexts, and it's sustained performance across all the tasks and contexts for the level. So let's unpack the assessment of proficiency and performance a little bit more, and then we'll figure out, what should we actually be focusing on in our classrooms. So when assessing proficiency, we're looking at how well a learner can use the language independently of specific instruction. The tasks are not rehearsed, and they may involve familiar and unfamiliar topics, but the focus is on sustained performance across those different tasks and contexts. Now, for instance, a performance assessment might involve a conversation with a native speaker where the learner has to navigate through topics they haven't encountered before, such as maybe discussing their opinions on something or describing an experience they've had either currently or in the past, or an experience that they might have in the future. Now, when it comes to assessing performance, now this is based on what has been presented in an instructional curriculum or other formal context. The tasks on the performance assessment have been rehearsed, maybe not that direct topic, but topics in that realm, and they reflect familiar context for that reason. And so the assessment determines whether the learner can meet the criteria for a particular level within those familiar contexts. So, for example, in a classroom setting, a performance assessment could involve role plays where students act out maybe buying something or talking about why they like a particular book or a movie. These are tasks that they have practiced on those topics pretty extensively in class. And so within the actual proficiency guidelines, it goes on to state that the rating that an individual receives on a performance assessment can provide evidence of how that individual might be rated on an assessment of proficiency, but it does not specify proficiency level as such. So it can give an indication, of how they might be able to perform on a proficiency assessment or in a real life situation, but it's not specifying their proficiency level as such. So performance builds the skills and the confidence that leads toward proficiency. So when we are guiding our students and scaffolding their learning and their skills and their vocabulary with language and getting them ready for those performance assessments, like an integrated performance assessment, all of that performance is building the skills and the confidence that leads toward proficiency. So when students encounter those spontaneous, unrehearsed situations, that they have the skills and confidence to engage in them. Now, I think what we would probably find is that on a performance assessment, students are going to produce more accurate language, more of the vocabulary that's specific to that topic. They're going to use the structures that they've been engaging with. But then when they are engaging in a different topic that is truly outside of that realm and unrehearsed, perhaps with another speaker outside of the classroom, their proficiency level might actually end up being lower because it is not part of that rehearsed kind of language that is happening when they're doing a performance assessment. But that performance assessment is providing them with the basic skills to help them growing in proficiency and also providing that confidence as well. So, what should we then assess in the classroom? Well, while performance assessments provide valuable insights into what learners can do within structured settings, proficiency assessments give that comprehensive picture of their overall language abilities. So what should we focus on assessing in our classrooms? Well, I think it probably seems pretty obvious by now, but I like to get into the trenches a little bit. So to find out what teachers are doing and why, I asked around. I did a little bit of a survey of what teachers are doing and how they approach proficiency assessments and how they approach performance assessments. And I did that on Facebook and Instagram and on Twitter, X, and a bunch of different places. And I just wanted to share with you some thoughts that teachers shared. So this first one is from Lake. And Lake says that a classroom is better suited to evaluate performance, given the nature of units and lessons, so there shouldn't necessarily be any expectation to formally assess proficiency. And then Shelley says that teachers can't grade proficiency. There are specialized assessments for it. We hope for proficiency and we plan for it, but we measure performance. I teach about proficiency, but I can only measure performance. And when she's talking about the specialized assessments, that would be like the OPI or the Apple. So those are those very specialized assessments for proficiency. And then we have Timothy, who says that we can do proficiency-based grading, the keyword being based. We are grading based on proficiency standards, but we are not grading proficiency itself. The distinction is not in the grading, but in the assessment itself. There's a performance assessment and proficiency, but they can both be assessed using proficiency guidelines. So that was one of my big takeaways from all of the details that I got from asking around, is this idea that we are grading based on proficiency standards, but we are not grading proficiency itself. So thank you so much to Timothy for that. He was also on the podcast last fall. So thank you so much for chiming in with that, Timothy. And then Bill goes on to say, I would say only grade performance since it should directly relate to what's covered in class. I see that. And then Dory says that since proficiency includes being able to use language on topics they have not learned in class, I'm not comfortable including proficiency assessments as part of their grade. Now, a lot of us have to deal with what their grades look like in our grading systems. And then the last one is from Hope. And Hope says that ACTFL has always maintained that proficiency is a rating and not a grade. Teachers have asked for a version that they can use for grading. I think the performance side is better used for that. So when we take these all together, it seems fairly clear that performance is the assessment objective when it comes to assessing students in our language classrooms. So then how should we be preparing students and planning out our lessons and our curriculum so that they are performing in a way on these performance assessments that prepares them for those situations where they're going to use the language in unscripted ways and spontaneous ways. So I would recommend to you that the best way to prepare students for those performance assessments, probably an IPA, an integrated performance assessment that touches on all of the communication modes, the best way to do that is to frame our instruction around the high leverage teaching practices. These are sometimes referred to as the ACTFL core practices, and I'll mention 6 of them here, but there are many more. So these are either referred to as high leverage teaching practices or the ACTFL core practices. And so the first one is to teach grammar as a concept. So rather than doing it in isolation, doing it as part of a overall concept or context of what you're teaching. To do backwards planning, where you're focused on what students are going to do with the language and therefore aren't just learning about the language. that you're providing appropriate feedback. The feedback is such an important part of the teaching towards performance because feedback towards proficiency is kind of an odd concept because they're actually not going to get feedback after the proficiency. But when you're preparing them for performance, part of those formative assessments along the way are going to have that feedback and that scaffolding. And then there's to use authentic resources. This is the opportunity to make sure that you're having culture embedded into the resources that students are listening to and reading. And then to use the target language for teaching, that's the teacher and the student, and moving towards that 90% plus target language use in the classroom. I always like to add the caveat that we mean 90% plus comprehensible language in the classroom. That doesn't just mean highly proficient, fluent language that students don't understand. That's not going to meet the goal. So we want to make sure that when we are using the target language for teaching and we are going for 90% plus target language, that it is comprehensible language. And then the sixth one is to make sure that our activities are truly communicative, that students aren't just practicing all the time with language, although that can be part of the process, but ultimately when they're communicating, they are doing something with the messages that they are producing or that they're listening to. So yes, you're exchanging language, but then what is the product after the fact? Why did you communicate? So by using these high leverage teaching practices, you're going to be touching on all the modes and preparing students for those performance assessments where you can use a rubric and see where they are performance-wise in terms of all the skills. And that is going to be the opportunity for feedback and the opportunity for students to gain that confidence that they will use in those unscripted situations when they will encounter the language, and also be able to put those skills to use in spontaneous ways. And to sum up these ideas of proficiency and performance, I just wanted to tell you this little analogy that actually comes from Language Testing International. They are the ones that have the APPLE test, which is the Actful Assessment of Performance Toward Proficiency in Languages. And they have this analogy about music and like playing an instrument, and how you can have a student that's learning an instrument and they can basically play some chords, like say it's a guitar, say it's a violin. They can read the music to some degree, and they can perform on a piece. They could maybe sight read and play something on the violin, play something on the cello, know the majority of the notes and how to do it. They might not be perfect, but they can pick it up, and based on their current level of proficiency, they can perform based on what they've learned and what they've mastered so far in that skill. But if they are performing a piece for a recital, it is going to be much more perfected. It's going to be much more polished. They're going to make sure and hit every note and every tone, and everything is going to be the way it should be. They might even have it memorized. But when we look at performance and we look at proficiency, that proficiency test that we give in language, it's not that music recital. It's not that one piece that has been perfected. That's what happens on a performance assessment. Students are focusing in on it. They're playing that piece that they're playing in the recital on that musical instrument. They're polishing it. But if you take that away and they just take a new piece of music and they start playing based on just the skills they have, those raw skills that they have with the instrument, that is going to be what their proficiency is. So I really like that analogy of looking at language learning and language acquisition as that instrument analogy, because it helps to see that, these performance assessments, those are the recital that they prep for, but then just picking up a new piece of music and playing it on the violin and seeing where they land with that, that's more the idea of proficiency when we're talking about language learning. So lots to ponder here. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So please continue to share what you think about proficiency and performance on Facebook, in my Facebook group, my Facebook page, or on Instagram or Twitter X. Just make sure that you are tagging WL Classroom so that I can get in on the conversation with you. And thank you to everyone who responded when I asked earlier about how they use performance and proficiency in their classroom. So be sure to check out the show notes where you'll see the blog post I mentioned earlier. So it's wolclassroom.com/proficiency and performance, but it's also in the show notes for you. And you can also sign up in the show notes for Talking Points, which is my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And there are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. And we can always do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.